Welcome to the One Life podcast, where we talk about things from One Life Church, but ultimately things we think can relate to you and your one and only life. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sarah Inman, and we are in a series called Centered, and we're just kind of exploring this question of what is a worldview, exploring what worldviews are, and asking some questions that we think are really important and meaningful to everybody's life. And today we're going to explore some of that and some questions with our friend Jeremy Evans. So Jeremy's here joining us today.
Hello.
And we've been starting all the podcast episodes during this series with Brett kind of doing a little bit of recap and teaching and just sharing some of his amazing wisdom with us.
Amazing wisdom. This week it's amazing wisdom.
Amazing wisdom.
It keeps building, and it's like, okay. Well,
and so co-host of the podcast
Yeah.
and our lead pastor, Brett Nicholson.
Now when I tell you things in the future, I'm going to intro it with, remember, the amazing wisdom is coming your way.
It's recorded too. You can always go back to it.
That's right. And the reason I'm doing this is because we said we want to build a Christ-centered worldview during the Centered series, but we also want to build confidence in a Christ-centered worldview, and then also learn how to have conversations about a Christ-centered worldview. That's the main thing we've been trying to do with the podcast, and that's why we had Jeremy today. We're going to explore his story here in just a moment, because he was into his adult life when he came to Christ and has a background that I think some of you will find very intriguing as far as where he came from and the kind of things that led him to Christ. But we've been focusing in on this passage in 1 Peter, and it says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience." And that's kind of home base for just remembering when we're talking to people. First of all, be prepared. But second of all, do this with gentleness and respect. It says that very directly. And that includes our social media, which all of us could probably use a little bit of help in, because it can be hard when you get in discussions with these things, not losing your temper, those kinds of things, because people care deeply about these kinds of issues. And if they say something that goes against the grain of who you are, sometimes we can kind of lose control. And that's why today I want to point out that word gentleness. It says gentleness. And I looked this up in a Greek dictionary, and they were saying that the word in the Greek is very hard to translate into English because we don't really have an equivalent, because we think of gentleness as maybe even weakness or being very soft with something. Sometimes translations say meekness, but it doesn't quite mean that either. What it means is controlled strength. Controlled strength. I heard one preacher several years ago use an illustration. He said, if you think about when you watch the Olympics, the gymnasts especially are like a picture of controlled strength. They have muscles on top of their muscles, but it creates the ability to make everything that they do look very graceful. And that's the idea of controlled strength. It's not saying someone who's weak. It's saying someone who has a lot of strength on the inside because they're connected to God, but they can exhibit that strength in a very, very controlled and respectful and kind way that's very strategic. And if you think about Jesus, whenever he was answering questions, the only time he ever lost his temper, well, I don't even know if he lost his temper, but when he went into the temple, but when he was fielding questions, he would ask return questions. He was a picture of controlled strength. And so whenever you're interacting with someone about faith and they say something that kind of hurts you or makes you mad or gets you, kind of runs up against the grain of who you are, always remember that thing of controlled strength. And I've learned just one little trick on that. If I feel myself starting to get emotional, you're never going to get emotional in a debate necessarily, or if you're kind of in a conversation where there's disagreements going on, ask a question. If you want to keep your controlled strength, I like to ask questions of anyway, but if you find yourself kind of ramping up, just kind of ease down and just ask a good question. Explore an idea more, especially what makes you say that, or why do you believe that way, or how have you come to see things that way? And that way you get back into being curious about their life instead of wanting to beat them, because this is not a competition. You're not trying to win a contest. You're trying to win over a person to faith in Christ. And so that gentleness thing really just kind of impacted me again with us developing our controlled strength. So with that, we're going to talk to Jeremy because, like I said, his background is he came to Christ at 30, which is not fairly typical for a lot of people. But the reason we talked to him during this series is because I happened to be sitting at a conference where they did a breakout session where there was a lady who had done her dissertation on Atheist who had become Christians and their characteristics. She had surveyed a number of them and just kind of gave us a list of the different beliefs and outlooks that atheists had before they became Christians, how they thought about Christians. And I tweeted some things out about it and everything. I was excited. It was a really, really fascinating thing. And Jeremy texted me and said, hey, I was a part of that study. And I thought, wow, right there at our own church. And so when this came up, we said, we've got to talk to Jeremy because that is his background. And we're going to kind of explore some of those things. So Jeremy, maybe you could just kind of start us off by giving sort of your background with faith kinds of things, growing up and going into adulthood, and what your vantage point was, and the kind of things you were raised with.
Yeah. So have not had family who were believers really at any point. And as a kid, went to church some, but usually it was to like be part of some sports league or something like that we happened to be a part of. I like to tell the story that we played baseball growing up my whole life, and my dad coached us, and I can only remember him ever getting thrown out of one baseball game that he was coaching, and it was our pastor who was the umpire who threw him out of the game. And so that was perfect. Okay, we're going to hear about this on Sunday. So
losing your temper. Yeah.
Didn't really get a whole lot of church in my life, and then growing up and getting older, church was usually about chasing a girl who happened to go to church, and so would end up kind of bouncing back into that environment at various times. And after college, moved to Evansville, and that was actually when I decided that I was going to become an atheist. And so I think there's an important distinction between sort of the American secular Christian, like, are you a Christian? Well, of course I'm a Christian, but there's no fruit. Like, they're not living that out. They don't go to church, that sort of thing, but they would call themselves a Christian, and someone who's actually sort of antagonistic to the faith, which is how I kind of identified myself. And so lived that way for 7 or 8 years. And then things changed.
Yeah. So you said you just decided to become? It was a thing?
Well,
it was a literal conscious decision?
I read some things, like read some Dawkins, read some Harris, and was really intrigued by the ideas that they were putting forward. Was intrigued by the idea that and a lot of it was confirmational for other things that I believed. Like when I would see Christians and observe them, I would see them as being very hypocritical. Mm-hmm. Saw them as being sort of anti-intellectual at times. Like one of the things that drove me crazy as an atheist and still drives me crazy to this day is when people say, well, God's mysterious. Like you played the get out of jail free card, the cosmic get out of jail free card for everything. Yeah. Well, we can't explain it. Right. Well, that's lazy. Like, or that's how I believed at the time. And, so started to read more and learn more, and decided that wasn't for me and that I was going to be an atheist.
Well, were there, and the answer might be a little bit sensitive here, were there people in your life that you actually, you don't have to name who they are, but just there were examples of Christians and you saw them as intellectual or whatever? Did you feel like you were getting a lot of examples of that, I guess is what I'm asking?
Gosh, I'm trying to think at the time. So that had been like the mid 2000s. And so I would say that for me at that stage of life, politics was probably a part of it. That I saw sort of prominent Christian conservatives who I felt like were very hypocritical. And I had not run into a Christian yet who, I think the other thing was I had not run into a Christian yet who seemed to be interested in spending the time to explore and explain and help me understand what was really true. And so it just was a sort of a bad combination, but it was just what happened, I guess.
So in some sense, there was sort of there were national figures, there were people that you saw on the news or on television or whatever, and that kind of painted with one brush, and then there was the absence in your personal life of just people there's a lot to go off of right there. I mean, in terms of, how can we be more open to getting the word out that we would be interested in having these kind of conversations?
Yeah. I mean, so maybe that's a good transition point to talk about how I came to.
Yeah.
Christ. So
I'm fascinated. I didn't know this. I haven't heard this story before. No. So I'm enjoying this a ton.
Well, good. I'm glad. So it was Tara, my wife. It's
that chase the girl to church thing?
That was what it sort of.
We're not recommending those, by the way.
No. That's not the strategy coming out of the One Life podcast today.
Right.
So I was married before I met Tara and got divorced. And my ex-wife found somebody else that she wanted to spend time with. And that's kind of how that unraveled. But Andy Stanley often says, or I've heard him say before, that you can deal with every intellectual objection that a person has, but until they get to that heart point, or that it's something you're going to feel your way across the finish line. Not necessarily that somebody's going to check all the boxes and you're going to feel like you made it. It's going to be something, it's going to be a heart change. And so got divorced, met Tara, and Tara was unlike any Christian I had ever met. She was obviously very passionate about her faith, and you know her well. She was she spent a year as a missionary in China teaching English to Chinese students, and she lives all out with her heart. Like, her heart just leads her around, and it was beautiful. And I was stunned by this person. This is the type of person I'd never really met. I don't know if I've told you this story, Brett, but I tell this story, and Tara doesn't like me to tell it, but I'm gonna tell it anyway. There was a time where we were first dating where I wasn't sure that she was right for me, and I was kind of thinking about ending things. And she happened to show me a video that all of her friends from Bethel made her when she went to China. And so it was just person after person after person saying how wonderful she was and how brave she was and how amazing. And it was people I respected and knew. And like, at the end of it, I was like, well, I can't break up with her now. I mean, look at all these people who said how awesome she is. But she was very, very patient with me. And I remember early on and this actually was fodder for the fire for me. There were Christians in her life who were saying, oh, you can't spend time with him. Don't spend time with him. Right. But she was patient, and she hung with me and introduced me to a guy who you know named Bob Kresge.
Yes.
And Bob, super intellectual guy, super passionate guy. And he really, there's a couple of things to draw from it. One is that he drew on the idea that I was impressed by intellectual arguments and that I wanted to talk about the intellectual things of it all. And so he taught me about the historicity of the Gospels. He taught me about how there's people who wrote stories about Jesus who had absolutely nothing to gain by telling the story the way that they did. And those stories coincide with what's in the Bible. And he was very patient with me. He was very relational, and just led me across the line of faith. We were sitting in Barnes & Noble, and he asked me a bunch of questions, and I said yes to all of them. And he said, well, if I had a cross around my neck, I'd put it on you. You're a Christian. And he got up and walked away. And that was the end of it. Okay, we made it. But so I think one was that he was willing to meet me where I was and deal with the objections that I had the way that I had them. But then two was Tara and her just ultimate commitment to relationality. Like, she was not going to let me get away, and she was not going to let biases or frustrations or relational problems hinder her ability to lead me. And she did.
Yeah.
And I feel like every conversation we've had during the series on the podcast, every one of them at some point or another has come back to relationship, like connection, relationship, people meeting you where you're at, I've heard someone else say a few weeks ago, kind of being on your level, like coming whatever level you're at, to just be able to have conversation and listening. And that always comes back to the conversation. And it's important, I think, to just keep highlighting that it's always about listening. It's always about relating in some way, rather in, like, even what you said earlier, just asking a question to get to know someone and not a question like, why are you so dumb? Like, that's not a question that we're saying you should ask. Like,
yeah, that's not a question I would recommend. I mean, try that. Yeah.
Nah, I don't like that. But I just want to highlight that because I keep hearing it, and it's a good reminder for me to keep hearing. But you were about to say something, Brett.
Yeah, I was wondering how, and maybe you said the timeline, and I blanked out or something, like with Bob, like, how easy did you go down? I mean, is this, was this two conversations, or was it
was
like,
probably over the course of about 6 months.
6 months. Okay.
We met several times, shared quite a few emails back and forth, and I addressed a lot of things that I saw as wrong or problems, and some of the things that I addressed as problems, he's like, "Yep, you're right." I was like, "Wait a minute." I'm used to you getting on the defensive now when I bring that up, and you're going to just tell me that I'm just right, that particular hypocrisy is a problem. And and so that's another thing is I think sometimes when we get to thinking about it like an argument or like a debate, we feel like there's a list of 1,000 points and we got to win every one or as many as we can. And sometimes you can win by losing and just let that point go, like, okay, yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah,
let's
that's
move
a
on.
fantastic point, because first of all, it is disarming. like, what are you going to come back with?
Right.
I'm right. Wait a minute, I'm not supposed to be right. We're
Right.
trying to get to a place here, but it kind of goes along with you. We've said, if you don't know, say so. I mean, if he didn't have an answer for something, which I know Bob well enough to know he probably did have pretty good answers for things in most questions that came up, or at least had some version of something. But at the same time, if someone makes a good point and you do think it's a good point, it's okay to acknowledge it and say, yeah. And maybe even that I've struggled with that myself. I understand the hypocrisy or whatever, because it would be kind of a disarming thing, and that's treating you more like a person than a project. I think it probably came across that way.
It's really interesting because I talked about that, God's mysterious argument, and the fact that drove me crazy, because it seemed like a cop-out. It seemed like anything we can't explain, we'll just call it mysterious and get on with it.
Right.
But what I've come to recognize is that if God made a whole universe and I can understand it, it's probably not all that special, right? Like, if I can understand everything there is to know, and I can't understand how you put a Toyota together, let alone anything else under the sun.
Right.
But the fact that it's hard to understand makes it worth being a part of, I think, in a way.
No, that's
solid
that
point.
was worth the listen right
You're welcome,
there.
folks.
If you're out there.
Have a great day.
Sorry. No, that's an excellent point.
And as I was thinking about, you were having conversation, and you said you had emails and conversation. For you in that moment, was that you seeking answers or seeking to, like, in that conversation, are you wanting him to say you're right? Are you wanting to change him? Are you wanting you to change? Are you just wanting more information? Is it just an exploration of questions?
Well, one of the things that I had identified as frustrating about Christians was that I felt like they got in the boat and then kind of stopped growing, or stopped learning, stopped challenging their assumptions. And sort of what I came to realize was I didn't want to be that. No matter what I decided, I didn't want to be that way. I wanted to be willing to and open to challenging what I had thought and what my experiences were. And so this was part of that pursuit, I guess. I don't know that I was expecting to come all the way across the line of faith as part of this conversation, but I was trying to grow personally. I never thought I would change his mind, because he's a pretty resolute fella. And same with Tara. I never thought I'd change her mind either. It's just that when I think when we first started dating, I was thinking, well, this isn't that important. Like, the faith issue is not important. I'm going to focus on the relationship that we have. And slowly that grew to be of greater importance, and obviously of the greatest importance to me.
Yeah. Do you remember, kind of on one hand, one of the things one of the struggles that he was able to help you overcome that was the easiest to believe? Like, what was the thing that went down the easiest? Like, oh yeah, okay, I never thought about that before. Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of this is very anti-intellectual of me, because I can't remember it. But going back to that idea of the historicity of the Gospels, and the idea that, okay, I can prove to you that this person wrote this, and I can prove to you that he had nothing to gain from writing it, and I can prove to you that it coincides with what the Bible says. Like, that was really powerful for me. And another one of the things that was a really deep concern for me, and I addressed this with him, and I think that's why he took that approach, is that it would always be very frustrating for me to talk with Christians who wanted to relate why they were right about things through the context of the Bible, and say, well, Jeremy, you're not right about that because this is what the Bible says about that. Well, I don't accept your Bible.
Right.
I understand that that's the authority for your life, but it's not for me. So how am I supposed to relate or interact with that idea? And so by kind of taking me outside that, he was able to help me come back around to it, to where now obviously I do accept the Bible as the authority for my life.
Yeah, well, and that's a point that needs to be reinforced as well, because it's a very common error. Because we do accept the Bible as an authority, it's easy to forget that the person sitting across the table does not. If they're not a believer, it's so, giving them Bible verses, it doesn't have the same impact, which seems commonsensical, but it's easy to forget because we take it so seriously. And if we accept it as the Word of God, well, you should as well. But that's the whole point. They're not just yet. Yeah. So how do you come at it from another place where you're still being biblical, but you're not just assuming the Bible's authority? And that's why we get into the subjects that we have been getting into, like apologetics and things like that.
Yeah, I want to add too to that, like the one of the things that Bob did for me was he was able to say, okay, here's your long list of objections, and I understand all that, and you've got some good points in there, and this one's not right, but you might be right about this. Let's just set all that to the side, and let's talk about Jesus Christ. Like, do you believe that he was born a virgin? Do you believe that he died and was risen again? And if you can decide that you believe those things, you owe it to yourself to accept him as your savior, and the rest of it, you can figure out the rest of it when you get on the other side of the finish line. Like, you want to deal with those things, let's deal with those things, but let's figure out the most important thing first. And that was a really powerful idea for me.
Yeah, and it would stick with you, and that's something we all recommend going forward, and we've talked about that here. Just if you're going to focus in on anything, it's Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection from the dead. If you can lock onto those things, then you can explore, where dinosaurs came from, or why did God have people do things in the book of Joshua, and all those kinds of things. Once you lock that in through the grid of Jesus, it's a very, very good point to remember. Talk to me more about stereotypes that you had, and maybe others, friends of yours. And I think this was a part of the study that you were a part of Christians. Was it purely an anti-intellectual and hypocrisy? Any others?
Well, this is going to be very flattering.
Well,
some of these things, hopefully some of these things aren't true of me now. I hope maybe they are. I felt like hate was a big part of religious people's lives, that there were large groups of people that we could just dispense with, and we don't have to worry about that group of people because they're living their life the wrong way. Right. And that was really like anathema to me. Like, I just couldn't tolerate that idea. I think the anti-intellectualism and the kind of I was very swayed by and don't have all the answers to ideas like evolution, the anti-science approach that I perceived from people who were religious was kind of frustrating to me, because I grew up going to science class every day and learned about gravity and chemistry and everything else, and thought that all sounded pretty good. And now all of a sudden, some of those scientific ideas were kind of coming under attack, and that was frustrating to me. And it's interesting that's an interesting point when you think about the scientists who were coming up with that stuff back in the day and how they wanted to glorify God through the work that they were doing. And so that's a weird mix. But I think closed-mindedness probably too, like not being willing to consider other viewpoints and consider other ideas was an important part of that as well.
Yeah. When you stand now on this side of the line and you talk to those who had been where you were, what are some things you try to keep in mind when you're communicate with people?
And this goes to my work too, at the Dream Center, is that I want the relationship between me and that person to always be the top priority. I'm not going to lose them based on something that I really don't want to lose them based on something that I say to them about what's true. Now, I need to be bold, and I need to express what the reality is. But at the end of the day, I want to tie that back to why I care about them and why I love them and why their progress in this way is important to me. So I was telling you before the podcast started, I've got a friend of mine who is a non-believer and reached out to me recently, was asking me some questions, and I'll always prioritize my relationship with him as I don't ever want to say anything to lose him, basically, as a friend. And I see that a lot in my work as well, because the people that I'm interacting with, very often families whose kids attend the Dream Center just don't have any religious context for their lives at all. There's a great story about a family that they were professing pagans, and they had a death in their family, and they approached us and said, well, you guys do that Jesus stuff. Can you pray for us? Because they weren't grieving. They were stuck. And couldn't find their way through it. And so our staff got to go to their home and say and pray, Jesus, be king of this place, which is such a powerful idea in a place of people who call themselves pagans. But if we hadn't prioritized the relationship with them and investing in them and earning credibility with them, we never would have been called into that place. And so that's what I would say for me. If in approaching someone new, I'm going to be thinking about my relationship with them first and how I can leverage that for the kingdom.
Right. I remember hearing a story of a friend of mine who he and his friends had spent a lot of time with a Muslim, and they became great friends and everything. But he said the Muslim finally stopped and said, wait a minute, I get the feeling that if somehow I never become a Christian, at some point you guys are going to move on to the next thing.
Peel off.
Yeah, you're not going to be my friend. You're waiting for me to decide one way or the other. And if I don't decide to do and believe what you say to believe, then you're gone. And it was kind of bracing for him, and I never forgot that. That's what I hear you saying. It's just like, okay, I'm going to love this person no matter what. And if we serve the one who says love even your enemies, then we can love all people. And you don't know how. It's kind of like with your kids. If your kids weren't believers most of their life, you wouldn't stop loving them at some point. You would keep working that relationship, keep fanning that flame, and you would be praying all the way till they were, at their deathbed that they come to Christ, but you would never desert their side.
Yeah.
And that's probably the greatest takeaway ultimately. I'm hoping everybody will not be anti-intellectual and they'll have good answers. But in the end, it's about genuinely caring about someone enough to where you just hang in there with them and do those kinds of things that you said you would do and that we all want done for ourselves if we were in the same shoes.
I think it's fascinating too. And I want to highlight that you mentioned Dream Center, and Jeremy's the executive director of Dream Center, and Jacobsville Kid Zone, which we talked a little bit about on episode 19 of the One Life podcast, which you can go back and learn a little bit more there. It's a really weird episode. Brett was on the TV. It's fun to watch. You should watch it.
Yeah, it's great. It was
a
not
great,
fun to do.
great
We
content.
learned, and we've never done it since.
But kind of we heard kind of your story of journeying in the track you've kind of taken, and now you're literally in a place where you're just sharing your worldview with kids and with families there. What is that like? I don't know, like that's a pretty big transition to go from one extreme almost to this other where you're right there all the time. What does that look like just throughout the week? I mean, are you enjoying having those conversations where you're like, I understand that, or is it just a
wow? I've worked in nonprofits my whole life. Started working for the fraternity back in 2002, and now 17 years later, I'm still doing it. And never in a million years thought I would ever work for a parachurch ministry. And sometimes people will call me and say, "So you're the pastor up there, huh?" No.
That's okay. You can be thought of that way. It's not that bad.
I mean, it's not bad. I just don't want them expecting something.
Yeah, there you go.
So exegete this for me.
Yeah,
no, I'm not going to,
things,
but thank you. So it is cool. We were talking about a group of girls who are getting into some shenanigans with each other at the Dream Center, which has been known to happen at the Dream Center, and they're just kind of getting in trouble. And we were able to sit them down and say, "Listen, do you know who God says you are? Because we don't. The way you're behaving would it seem to indicate that you don't, and we want you to know." And they didn't. They were able to say that's news to me. I had never heard that before. And so blazing those trails in kids' lives is pretty powerful. Yeah. It's pretty exciting. Crunching new snow, as Brett introduced to me some years ago, in those kids' lives is pretty powerful. These are kids who their experience does not necessarily lend itself towards the traditional happy Christian lifestyle sometimes. And so on the one hand, it can be very difficult to get them to believe in something. But on the other hand, how powerful to have that in their arsenal, to have the belief that we have, to be able to go back to and say, well, I'm seeing this in my life right now and it's not fair and I don't like it, but I know I've got a greater destiny ahead of me. I've got something bigger coming down the line. That's a pretty big deal.
It's amazing. And as you were saying your story, it made me think of like in Dream Center, which I've been there multiple times and see just the amazing kids that you get to interact with. And it's never about like you're waiting for them to do something. You're just supporting them where they're at. Like, right? I mean, it's this beautiful thing that is happening. And I guess that's a great thing I want to add as we come into the holidays. With something coming up with Dream Center, people can jump in, support, be a part of.
Yeah, so we have our Feast with Friends. It's the day before Thanksgiving. It's from 5 to 7 at the Dream Center. We serve Thanksgiving dinner. The West Side Nut Club smokes 50 turkeys in our parking lot that day. It is a phenomenal day, and so people should come eat because we got a lot of Thanksgiving. But then
my goodness,
people, I'm telling you,
50
coming
turkeys.
in the day before Thanksgiving. That's what we all need to do is have a feast.
Let me ask you
right
something. Have you ever
feast.
had 2 Thanksgiving dinners and been like, I regret one of those?
No way.
That's
Solid
true.
point.
Go for it. So that's on the let's see, I think it's the 27th. And then on Saturday, December 14th, we're actually for the first time ever hosting Affordable Christmas at Delaware Elementary School.
Oh,
so
wow.
we make a big deal out of Christmas every year. This year we have taken it up a notch and are trying to provide Christmas not just for the kids that we serve at the Dream Center, but for every single kid at Delaware Elementary School. So that will be December the 14th, and people can learn more about that on our Facebook Facebook page, Dream Center Evansville. Can learn to volunteer, can learn about volunteering, can potentially adopt a kid for Christmas as well. It's going to be awesome, man. It's going to be a big party. December 14th from 3 to 6 at the Dream Center.
December 14th. Okay.
Every single Delaware student. Oh.
And that's roughly how many students?
And their parents. Their parents are coming too. It's about 440 kids.
Oh my goodness, that is going to be a party. And it's all crammed into the Dream Center facility there?
Time slots. We're going to have time slots.
Okay. Good.
That's super exciting.
Run really smoothly.
It is. It's great.
Yeah.
Great.
That's awesome.
People need to know that kind of thing is going on in our fair city. So that's good stuff.
Yeah.
From
Jeremy,
a guy that made a study about
That's right.
atheist of all people.
That's right. He turned it around.
Yeah, he absolutely
God turned
did.
it around.
That's cool.
This is great. I love this conversation, being able to, one, for me, learning more about you, which is cool, learn more about your story, and then also seeing kind of the journey and the excitement. I love the excitement when you're talking about Dream Center and the kids. Like, if you're not watching this episode of the podcast, you should go find it, because just watching Jeremy get excited talking about Dream Center and kids and their families is really cool. So, Brett, as we close out, anything to add or to close out with?
Well, I'm hoping you'll stay tracking with what we've been talking about on the podcast, especially, and the same principles keep coming up over and over again when it comes to about having conversations about worldviews. So keep listening, because we are going to just keep exploring this idea, because it is important. And it's not only for people maybe that you work with or the atheists you know in your life. It's really important for your kids, especially as they get a little bit older. They're your teenagers. Probably the toughest conversation I ever had was with my daughter when she came home from school, and she had been fielding questions herself, and her and I took a very, very long drive, and she asked some really, really tough questions, but had at least enough preparation to know how to do that. And so this is really, really important stuff. So, and then we're going to continue. We got 3 more installments of Centered coming up. And I think it's, to me, it's going to be the funnest one, because the first one is going to be, who is Jesus? And we're just going to explore who he is, because we need to remind ourselves of that, and then his cross and his resurrection. So good stuff coming.
Awesome. Jeremy, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Anytime.
All right.
Anytime.
Has there been a 3-timer yet on the podcast?
That's a great
Besides,
question.
Ryan's been on quite a few times.
Oh, okay.
But
he works here.
But he was
Yeah.
technically as a
Yeah.
guest. It was
Sure.
more kind of co-hosting,
That's true. Yeah.
sort of, not the same thing. So
Yeah. So, yeah.
If
could
you're
be the
looking to
first
do an
one.
episode about the 2020 Chicago Cubs, I'd be happy to come on and
Oh,
break
man.
that, give you some analysis
okay, we
2010
need to do
Cubs.
that.
on the new team.
I bet if we put word out, we would have
We get a live
tremendous
audience for that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Could be.
We get a live
It's a
audience
niche
for that one.
audience,
That's
but
true.
it would be a big.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And reminder, you can always email us any questions you have, or want some more information. You can email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org. And you can find the short films and all the messages for the Centered series on the One Life app or onelifechurch.org. Thanks so much for joining us. We'd love to hear from you guys. You can email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org. You can leave a comment on YouTube or on Apple Podcast or anywhere you're listening to this podcast. We'd love for you guys to share that out. Let more people hear this great content and have an opportunity to continue that conversation even further. Our music was produced by Micah Robertson and Ben Brock. My name's Sarah, and I produced this episode.